You'll find Assessment Task 2 information within the DigiApps unit on Studentweb. Scrolling down to the group that has been made for Assessment Task 2, there is really only a few documents here that we need to complete this assignment. The first one we'll look at will be the Assessment Task 2 brief itself, the cover sheet. The second document we'll take a look at is the reference project, or the reference set of plans that we're all going to start with for this assignment, and then we're going to develop them individually. And then the third document you might need further down the track is the Photoshop shortcuts. These are this is an Adobe Photoshop document that houses all the shortcuts that you're going to need, and that may suit as a good reference going forward. Taking a look at the assessment task cover sheet, we can see that the assessment brief really follows the same structure as all other assessment tasks for the DigiApps unit. And as we've done previously, I'm going to go through just sort of the high level, the big ticket items, but I encourage you to go and download this file and read it in full, just to make sure that you fully understand what's required of this assessment. So again, this is assessment task 2 of 4 for the unit, and this is our Photoshop floor plan. This assignment's due on the 21st of April, so still quite a while away. And as normal, this is where I will place your feedback for the assignment. So again, you've got around 8 weeks, 56 days, just over 2 months to complete this assignment. Plenty of time there. More than enough time to be able to finish this assignment, and if we feel like we need a little bit more time as we go along, we can make those adjustments as required. Really, the context of this assignment is that students are to create a colored rendered floor plan of an apartment building using Adobe Photoshop, and you're to demonstrate the learned techniques and workflows and commands taught within the class. And this is pretty easy to show and to demonstrate, because the Photoshop file that you'll submit will house all of those layers, adjustments, and all the creations that you've been working on throughout the assignment. Which really then lends to the next point, which is what to submit for this assignment. There's 2 documents that you'll end up submitting. One will be the Adobe Photoshop .psd file, so Photoshop document file. That's the native Photoshop file that you use to create the image. And then the second one will be a digital submission of the final rendered floor plan on a title block in a JPEG image format. And this will be a 4K image, so no less than 4,000 pixels. And then you'll submit this obviously on Studentweb. And again, you'll receive bonus marks or you'll lose marks instantly just for the file naming. So in this instance, file name is assessment task 2 - your initials - your student number. Those are easy marks to obtain. Scrolling down to the end, we have the grading rubric, and this doesn't look too dissimilar to the AutoCAD grading rubric. Just the categorization of grading, or categorization of items that are being graded, are slightly different. So the first component is composition, and this is really a set of mostly yes or no questions, like do you have a north arrow, yes or no? Have you even labeled your rooms, yes or no? Do you have your name on the title block, yes or no? Pretty simple stuff. The second component is a little bit more subjective, so it's about a sliding scale of the quality of your textures. What's the quality of the furniture you're using, the joinery, how good are the light and shadows, how strong are they cast in the right direction, do the highlights look realistic, items such as that. And then you've got, making sure that you've created the JPEG image on the title block and the way that that's set out, how does that look? And then finally uploading both the documents, the PSD Photoshop file and the JPEG image, online to Studentweb using the correct naming system. So when we download the reference floor plan off of Studentweb, which is the reference floor plan we'll be using for this assignment, we can see that it is a 3-bedroom apartment. And this is actually a real apartment building within Melbourne. And we're going to take this and transform this and use this as the base for our Photoshop assignment. So we'll end up cleaning this up, transforming it, and then turning this basic line floor plan into something that looks more like this. So you'll end up with a finished rendered floor plan with textures, lighting, smart objects, shadows, contrasting elements, and then we'll save that image out and then open up another Photoshop file where we'll put this image onto a title block, and that's where you can see you've got the numbers, like the labels of each of the rooms. Then you put down the key or the legend of what those rooms are, the scale bar, the north arrow, etc. And then we'll save that as a 4K image, and then this is the final photo or the final JPEG image that you'll upload to Studentweb along with the Photoshop PSD file. So what exactly is Photoshop? Photoshop, or Adobe Photoshop, is a raster graphics editor. So it's a pixel-based editor, unlike a vector-based. So when you zoom really close to an image, you will start to see the actual images break down in terms of pixels compared to, say, a PDF file or AutoCAD, where no matter how far you zoom in, the lines never pixelate. That's a vector-based software. It was first developed and published by Adobe Incorporated. It was originally designed from day one to run on both Windows and Mac operating systems, and was in fact one of the first Mac operating system softwares that were developed outside of Apple themselves. And it was originally created in 1988 by Thomas and John Knoll. And these were really one of the first Silicon Valley companies during that sort of golden age when Silicon Valley was just getting started, along with Apple and Dell. Adobe was one of the first. And it really is the industry standard for not only raster graphics editing, but digital art as a whole. There really isn't anything else that holds the market share that Adobe Photoshop does. Just on a side note, if you're ever interested, Adobe actually has a really fascinating history, and Cold Fusion channel on YouTube's done a fantastic sort of a short doco on its history, and it's actually really fascinating, where one of the founders was at one stage kidnapped and held ransom because of the success of the company. And yeah, it is actually just a really fascinating story of how they've taken a business from a garage to arguably one of the biggest software companies on the face of the earth. So Photoshop and architecture, what do we really need to understand there? It is a close second in terms of CAD and 3D architectural software. You may have one firm that uses AutoCAD only, another firm that uses Revit only, another firm that uses ArchiCAD only, and another one that may only use Rhino. But I can almost guarantee you that most of those firms are all using Photoshop. It is that popular. There is an abundance of tutorials scattered all over the internet, so the software is capable of almost anything, and someone somewhere has probably tried to do what you're trying to do, so there's a great wealth of knowledge that's on the internet. It really has a limitless workflow. Again, it's really limited by your imagination only. And for architecture, it's predominantly used for renders like floor plans, elevations, visualizations like 3D visualizations, diagrams for presentations, and even just client documentation. And Photoshop can be used at both the basic and the expert level. You'll probably find that it's like an exponential process. It's not actually linear. I know we've spoken about this in other classes where CAD is quite a linear software. The more time you spend in it, the better it becomes. Revit is kind of a reverse exponential software where you spend a lot of time in it to begin with, and you get a very big return on investment in terms of time the longer the project goes on, or the more content that's developed. And Photoshop's kind of a different model where it is exponential in the traditional sense, in that you can work in a Photoshop file and it will look pretty decent, but to get it to that just slight next level where it is exceptional is an exponential amount more time. And that really comes down to how well you know the software and just time in the software and practice. But, there are people that do this, 5 days a week, every week of the year. So there are always experts that are at that next level. And just on that, there are just so many tutorials online that will go far beyond anything I teach here, and that are just amazing, amazing resources from studio houses that do this full-time as a business. Some of my favorites personally these are all YouTube channels, by the way. Surviving Architecture, a really good one. Platform Studios, they're a professional studio that does render graphics in Photoshop. Upstairs are a fantastic platform. They have a lot of good resources that you can download as well, like textures, bitmaps, and people cutouts. My favorite personally is Archi9 visualization. That's the image, an example of their work on the left hand side, where you're seeing at the top image is an original render that they've just started with, and then underneath is the edited final version from Photoshop. And Show It Better is also a really good resource to use. So just a reminder that Adobe Photoshop is the second of 4 softwares that we're learning. We're obviously working away in AutoCAD, and once we're done with both of these softwares, we then move into the 3D realm. So let's take a look at the interface of Photoshop. Traditionally, when you open it up, it's going to look something like this. This is once we've opened up a project document, and in this case, I've just got an example of the finished floor plan or something that we'll be doing along the lines of this in this assignment. The center position, or the center point, most obviously is called the canvas. This is the main area where your document is edited. It's where you, apply colors, textures, edit the image, and whatnot. On the right-hand side, you've got, in my instance, you've got 3 different boxes. This whole panel on the right-hand side is called the palettes, and you have different types of palettes. In this instance, by default, you'll have the layers palette that's opened, which is here. Underneath of that, I choose to have my brush settings, and you can choose to have whatever you want, whether it's color correction or a photo library or whatever it may be. But personally, I find that I use the brushes on a very regular basis, so it's good to have those there in quick succession. On the left-hand side, you have the toolbar, and the commands for each of these we'll go through once we go through the user interface tour in the software. Across the top, you have the main menu, and the main menu houses, file, edit, image, etc. But basically, every command within Photoshop is within these main menus. You have buttons around and shortcuts as well that you can use, but at the end of the day, every single command is going to be within one of those drop-down menus. Underneath of that, you've got the options bar, which acts a lot like the ribbon in AutoCAD, in which when you click on a different command or when you activate a command, that options bar will update to options relevant to that command. So some of the key concepts to get your head around within Photoshop. These are concepts that not necessarily you would need to memorize, but the better you know these concepts, the more robust you will be at developing your skills. The quicker you'll develop them, and more than likely, the better the results will be. So let's the first concept to look at is non-destructive editing workflows. And really what that means is when you edit a document or an image, you do it in such a way that the original is always accessible. And that could be duplicating the original image and making it another layer and then hiding that layer. Or it might be in the way that you adjust the image, like the way you add color correction or the way you add contrast. You don't do it so it applies it to the image. You do it in the way that it applies it to a layer that then is applied to the image. So this way you can always go back. This is critical because destructive editing is making direct edits to the image or to the photo. And besides the fact that maybe you want to change something at a later stage, more than likely, especially in practice, your client will want to update something or want to change something. And if you have to go back and it's destructively edited, it basically means you have to start from scratch, which is a massive time waste. So non-destructive editing workflows are really important just to understand what that term means. The second term is bitmaps and textures, and the word seamless is critical here. So textures and bitmaps, they're both the same terminology, just really I find bitmaps is used more in gaming and textures more in photography. But what they are essentially is they're usually square images of materials. So you'll see a square box, which is an image of floorboards or brick or carpet or grass. And the seamless component about that means that they'll be able to be stitched together or tiled together without seeing the join between where one image begins and the other one ends. And that's critical when trying to texturize a whole image. Think about games as well. In games, we'll use the same texture again and again, but the way that they're joined is so seamless that you never actually notice it. And so when you're searching for images, you might say, I want to find, I don't know, grass texture or carpet texture or weatherboard texture. It's important to put seamless in the search bar to make sure it picks up those images that won't be obvious when they're tiled. You've got the two different color methods that are most used within Photoshop, which is RGB and CMYK. And so RGB is a color model that's an additive color model which uses red, green, and blue as the primary colors of light that are added together in various ways to reproduce, millions of colors. And it is a system that works on computer screens. It's designed for digital assets, so for monitors, for computer screens, for phones, etc. RGB is not normally, in fact, it is not the professional method in which to do print media. Print media uses a CMYK model, and that is a subtractive color model based on the CMY color model used in color printing, and is used to describe the printing process itself. CMYK refers to the 4 ink plates that are used in some color printing, that being cyan, magenta, yellow, and key. In other words, key is black. So if you're converting a document from RGB to CMYK, you'll notice that the colors will sort of dull down. They may not be as vibrant, but then when you're going to a printer, it's very common that students will develop these amazing renders, and then they'll go to a printer and they'll print them, and it won't look anything like what it does on screen. And that's because the render on the screen has been modeled or been colored in RGB, not in CMYK. The next concept to get your head around is layers, and layers in Photoshop work basically like layers in all softwares. It is the main method in which you control objects. In this instance, it will be smart objects, images, textures, color corrections, adjustments, whatever it is. You can turn them on and off, you can mask them, you can group them, all pretty typical. So there are many adjustments, just a few adjustments, and these adjustments you can make to all layers. And again, you can make them destructively. In other words, you make them and then you can't go back. Or the way that I'll show you is non-destructively, where they're added as like an adjustment layer that's then applied to any layer underneath of that one. So some of them might be levels. Levels really affect, it almost looks like an equalizer band where you can adjust, bottom tones or upper tones or whatever it may be. You have hue saturation, which controls sort of either the hue that's used throughout an image. So take this image on the left-hand side, the bottom image, you would say that this has a golden, orangey, greenish hue to it, essentially. And it's relatively low saturated. And that's one of the key metrics that we'll go through within this Photoshop file, is that in architectural images, you want to be desaturated as much as possible. This image at the bottom is not strong. Like those blues, grays on the building on the left-hand side is not very prominent. The sky itself is not like a bright baby blue or crystal blue. It's a very pale, desaturated blue. Color correction's another one. That's where you pull certain colors out of an image. You might want to pull reds or greens out of an image. Pretty typically, you'll find that textures will come in and they're very heavily, they've got very heavily a blue light. I mean, a great way to sort of use an analogy of this is most smartphones today have like what's called a blue screen filter. That's exactly like a color correction for your phone, where it will dial back the blues and then dial up more of the reds and the yellows to soften that color. And in that case, it's meant to be easier on your eyes. But in this instance, we're talking about color correction purely from an aesthetic point of view. And then finally, commands. There are many shortcuts and commands for Photoshop, and they're a little bit different to AutoCAD, where you don't type in something and then hit enter. You'll just press a key on the keyboard and then the command will be activated. On Studentweb, there is a document that you can download under the Assessment Task 2 shell, which is an official Adobe document which just has almost every command within Photoshop. However, I'll go through each of the commands as we go through the assignment, and I highly recommend that you have a notepad or something like that where you write down the key commands. There are literally hundreds of commands, but to be honest, within architecture and in Photoshop, You probably only need to know a couple of dozen, and that will do almost every instance you can think of. So I've opened up Photoshop, and it takes me to the home screen where I've just clicked on Open File, and I'm going to open up the Photoshop floor plan that we're going to use for this assignment, and then click Open. It's then going to prompt me, it's going to give me an Import PDF menu, and basically everything here is all good. It's going to change it. The mode is going to be RGB color. That's important to make sure that that is the same. The rest of this is basically all good. The one page is selected because there is only one, but if we're importing multiple PDF sheets, then you can either choose them and they'll import as separate documents. I'll then go OK, and then that will open up. Now we'll open up, but you can see there's no white background, and that's because this is a vectorized image, so the white background will disappear. That's pretty typical when you're opening up CAD files. Now, in the introduction to Photoshop, I went through the general layout of the user interface, so I won't go through it in a basic level, but we'll go through this as we need to work through the assignment. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a white background, and then we're going to flick this image to the right clockwise 90 degrees. So first of all, let's go down the menu bar or the toolbar on the left hand side. Each one of these does have a shortcut. I personally prefer to use the shortcuts where I can, and in order to know what those shortcuts are, all you need to do is hover your mouse over it, and there's a little video that will appear along with the name of the command and the associated shortcut. Again, unlike in CAD, you don't have to type the letter or letters into the keyboard, then hit spacebar or enter. As soon as you hit that key, it will initiate the command. So in this instance, I'm going to come down to here to the rectangle tool, which is the shortcut is U. And then some of these commands or some of these tools will have little arrows to the bottom right-hand corner. If you hold your mouse over that, it will then bring up a sub-menu of different options for that one command. In this instance, yours might be set on Line Tool by default. So I'm just going to hold my mouse down and then click on Rectangle Tool. Once I do that, the options bar then changes, and the most important component to look at here is the fill for this rectangle is going to be black, and the stroke, which is like the outline of the rectangle, is also going to be black. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to make sure I pick white, and then for the stroke, I'm also going to pick white. So that's now done. Now to draw the rectangle, I'm just going to simply, in the middle of this black space here, just click and drag my mouse to one side to the other. We'll then get a white background. So I'm going to go back to my move tool, which is V on the keyboard, or it's the first tool up here in the toolbar, and that's now complete. Now that rectangle, that colored white rectangle, is sitting on top of the CAD drawing, so we need to rectify that. And looking in the layers area, we can see that rectangle is sitting on top of layer 1. So I can click on rectangle and just simply move my hand down, drag it down, and that will then stack it at the bottom of the stack. The other thing to note about layers is we can rename these, and I suggest that you do it as you go along because it'll be very, very, very easy to lose track of your layers. So I'm going to double click on where it says layer 1. I'm going to type in CAD lines in capitals. Hit enter, and that's it. All good. Now what we're going to do is we're going to rotate this whole document 90 degrees to clockwise. So I'm going to go up to image, and then image rotation, and then 90 degrees clockwise. I do that and the whole document changes, which is great. So now to navigate the canvas space, the way to do so, if I zoom in and out with my mouse, you can see I'm not getting anywhere. I need to hold Alt on my keyboard and then zoom in and out. You can see that will initiate the zoom command. Once I'm zoomed in, to get around, the easiest way is to hold down spacebar and then just click with your mouse and drag around. And that acts as sort of like a grab tool. But I'm holding down spacebar on my keyboard, and I'm holding the left mouse click on the mouse and just moving my hand. When I let go of the spacebar, that will still keep the command, but as soon as I let go, that will end the command, and now I won't be going anywhere. The other way to move around is once I'm zoomed in, when I use the scroll wheel, I'm going to scroll up and down now that I'm zoomed sufficiently into the drawing. And then to move left to right, you can hold Control on the keyboard, and that will move you again left to right. So Alt, scroll wheel to zoom in and out, spacebar and normal mouse click to pan around, or when you're zoomed in, scroll up and down to move up and down, and to move left and right, hold down Control and scroll. Okay, so I'm going to zoom out slightly so I can just see the drawing. That's good. And so what we're going to start doing is we're going to start coloring in these different areas. Like every area essentially will need a color using the paint bucket. But before I do that, we're actually going to edit this PDF a little bit further. And so what we're going to do is we're going to clean this up. We're going to remove all of this text here. We don't need this text for the sake of this drawing. So in order to do that, I need to first make sure I'm on the right layer. So I'm currently on the CAD's layer and CAD lines layer. We know that because that layer is like a light gray compared to the rectangle, which is a dark gray. When I click on the rectangle, you'll see that that is now light gray, so that's activated. So I'll go back to my CAD lines layer. And I'm going to zoom right in to where there is some text down here. And I'm going to use my marquee tool. So the marquee tool is essentially like a selection box, and the shortcut for that is M, or it's the second tool in the toolbar. I'll just click that, and now what I have to do is just go around, just click and drag wherever there's text, and then hit delete on the keyboard. So it's deleting content from that layer. If I was to do that, you'd know I was doing that on the wrong layer if, for instance, I go to my rectangle tool, my rectangle layer, and I do the same thing again and hit delete, you'll see that it will throw up an error saying that if I want to delete that, I'd have to change the type of shape. It's going to be a different shape, and then it would end up deleting that area. So always make sure you're on the right layer. So now that we've done that first one, we can then select the next one, hit delete. I'm going to keep going around here, hit delete on each of the text. Okay, to deselect, so you can see that when I zoom out, that selection box is still there. In order to get rid of that selection box, I can just end up selecting another area, and it goes from here, it will be created here. Or the other way is Control D on the keyboard. That's deselect. And be careful that your selection boxes are nice and neat and tidy. Like let's say here in this pantry, if I accidentally select this wall and hit delete, you'll see it will delete that portion of the wall as well. And if you do make a mistake, Control Z will allow you to go back one step, but it will flicker just one step. So if you keep hitting Control Z, it's like go back, go forward, go back, go forward. If you want to continue going back, it's Control Alt Z. Will continue to move back in time. You can do that manually as well by going edit, step backwards as well. I can also move the selection box too, just by clicking and dragging. So once I grab my section box like this, I can hold, I'm not clicking anything, not doing anything. I can just hold my mouse over the selection itself, click, and then I can drag that selection around. So if I like the size of this selection, I can move this around the building. Now, of course, again, I've stuffed that up, so I'll go Control Alt Z to keep going back in time. Okay, and then Control D to deselect. And then I'm just going to keep going here. And it will take time to begin with in terms of how long it takes you to navigate around and get used to the commands, because it is different to CAD. But just like any other software that you learn over time, you'll get quicker and quicker at it. All right, almost done. Is that it? Just the fireplace here. Excellent. Okay, now that's done. We've finished editing the PDF. Now next up is using the paint bucket tool. And the reason why we're doing this is, every material, everything that you want to be a different material will need to have a different color, because in order to cut and then paste that material into that area, it does it via identifying the color. Now, there are many ways you can do this in Photoshop, and architectural firms use different methods, but this is probably the method that I believe is probably easiest. So it's the method that we'll use for this assignment. But if you see something online where people are cutting textures into plans in a different method. Again, there's no right or wrong, it's just multiple workflows to do the same thing. So very, very important that we make another layer, then use the paint bucket tool on that layer. So just quickly, before I show you the paint bucket tool in detail, I'll just show you as an example what happens if you do the wrong thing here. So let's say, I'm just gonna draw. Okay, so let's say I paint some red in here, and this red is gonna be, I don't know, it's gonna be floorboards, let's say. I've done that on the CAD lines layer. So when I paste some material in here, I'm still going to see little feints of red around the outside. And if I want to turn this red paint off, I turn this layer off, and it turns off the whole thing. It turns off the CAD lines as well, which is a big no-no. And so what I'm going to do is and I want you to follow along with this as well, we're going to create another layer specifically for the paint, and then that way we've got that control independently of the CAD lines. So in order to create a new layer, in the layers palette, there's a little rubbish bin on the bottom right hand corner, and then that's to delete a layer. Next to that is to create a new layer. So I'm going to click that, and you'll see layer 1 is created. Again, I'm going to double click on that, and I'm going to call that one, I'll just call this one colors. All right, now I want to make sure I'm on that layer, and I am because it's a lighter gray. I've selected that one. And now I'm going to go back through using the paint bucket tool and go through that process again. So paint bucket tool, again, for yourself, you may look like this by default. It may be the gradient tool. So wherever you see this gradient tool, it's just above the little finger, the smudge tool. You click on the little arrow, hold your mouse down, and then select the paint bucket. Okay, so that's all good. We also want to double check in the options panel up the top, make sure that yours has all layers ticked. If not, what will happen is when I use the paint bucket, it essentially paints the whole drawing or the whole canvas. It doesn't take into account any boundary lines from other layers. So if that's happening, make sure that all layers is ticked, and now you'll see wherever I paint, it's just going to paint within those bounding lines. Okay. So, and it's really important when doing this, in order to change your colors, you come down to the little swatch here, and you just click on that, and then you can pick whatever color you want going through the color wheel. But when doing this, pick really high contrasting, essentially horrible colors, really horrible colors. And the reason for that is because the further apart the colors are, and the more bright or vibrant they are, the better that Photoshop selects those pixels to then select and then being able to paste your texture within that layer, within that area. So I'm going to pick this this limey green sort of color, and I'll click here. And I want to make sure, if this is my floorboards, I want to make sure that I'm clicking on the inside of the door swing as well, because that is obviously floorboards as you enter the apartment. So that all looks good. That's all going to be floorboards. Yes, I reckon that's all of it. Yep, I'm going to keep the rooms as carpet. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go click on this little green swatch and then change the color up. So now let's go to like a purple. And then this purple will be, say, carpet. So I'm going to come into the bedroom, click there. And again, make sure I'm clicking inside the door swing, because of course that would be carpet from that point there. And it's not going to be the rug. The rug will be a different material. So again, every time there's a change in material, you want to make sure there's a change in color. So it's very rare. I wouldn't recommend it here that you have different types of carpet. So the general carpet for the bedroom will be the same as in these bedrooms. So I'll click here, and again, inside the door swings. Now let's say, for instance, I want the study in here to also be floorboard, but I've just finished using this color. If I click on this, it's going to be almost impossible for me to pick the same green again. Even if I try and eyeball it right now, something like that. That is close, but it's definitely not the same. So the quickest way to select a previously used color is, while I'm in the paint bucket tool, I'm going to hold Alt on my keyboard, and you can see what happens. I get these little crosshairs that appear as my mouse. You might see something slightly different where it looks like a little eyedropper. Either way, just click and you'll see that my swatch updates to that color. And again, I'll prove it if I hover my mouse over the carpet, hold down Alt on my keyboard and click, you can see that the swatch is updated to that color. So I'm going to click Alt and then select and sample the green that was here in the kitchen area and throughout the living areas. And then I'll go into my study and I'll give it that same texture, that same color for my floorboards. Now my tile area, I'll do that again. I'll click now a completely different color. So let's go for a blue. Yep, all looks good. All right, that's my tiles. Okay. And this same principle applies for even items that that don't necessarily need color. So take for instance, like you might have the kitchen sink is just going to be like a silvery, like a stainless steel, or it might even be like the toilet or the bath. Still give them a color because we still want to put some sort of shading on that, and using a color selection tool helps us select those pixels individually rather than just going around and tracing around the outside of those shapes. So even then, items that are going to end up being white, I make a point of making them quite bright as well, so I know for sure that I've got some color associated to items that will end up being white. And again, you can see there, I accidentally selected like the actual lines for the actual file like that. Just Control Z will go back, and if I need to go back further, Control Z Alt or Control Alt Z. So that's all good. Now, importantly, throughout this whole period, I've been doing this on the colors layer, and that's important because I can click on the little eyeball here, and that will then turn off that layer, but it keeps the CAD lines separate. And in fact, I can do the opposite where I can turn off the CAD lines, and you can see now I've got like a perfect tracing of that with those colors. And this gives a good example of what Photoshop is trying to do. We are trying to select these colors, which then inherently is going to pick up these boundaries, which then gives us a great cut or a great area for us to insert our materials into. Okay, so what you need to do in the first class is essentially I would have a piece of paper and I'd be writing down the textures and the colors that are associated to it. So in this instance, lime green equals floorboards, light purple equals carpet, blue equals tiles, etc. And do this for everything until basically everything in the drawing has a color associated. This includes couches, chairs, tabletops, the rug. Everything needs to have a color associated to it on the colors layer. So when you turn off the CAD lines layer, you essentially have the drawing just in multicolors. And so once we do that, we can then download some textures and start inserting those textures into place. So when we look at textures, there are a number of different websites that we can use as reference. And what you'll end up with, or what you want to build, is a good filing structure of textures that you can use for basically all projects. There's a few tips to look at when looking at textures. First of all, there are some great resources online. So CG Trader is a really good resource. You can get a lot of textures here for free. This is used massively by the gaming industry for textures, but you can also find like models and stuff like that here, 3D models. Archie9 have photo packs, which is really good. So you can either get like photos to insert into images, or you can get textures as well. The other one that I mentioned was Upstairs. These guys are a great resource, and you can pay for these if you want to. And you'll know that there's really good textures, and you'll see there's different packs here. So if I click on one, they'll download as JPEG or RAW files, but you can see here the example of some of these textures. And the third option is simply just to use Google image search, remembering, of course, as I said in the introduction to Photoshop, that you want to make sure you use the word seamless when searching for textures. And any of these really will be pretty good, provided there's no watermarks on them. So this one here, you can see there's a watermark. That's no good. But this one, for instance, has that got a watermark? Yes, that does have a watermark. So the trick will be finding one that is of relatively good size that doesn't have a watermark. And that one's pretty good there. The second tip is that you don't need a pattern or a material with every type of color under the sun, because later on this assignment, we'll learn that you can basically make any texture, any color, if it's monochromatic to begin with. So what I mean by that is, let's go into my files. So this is my file of textures and lights and photo packs. And I'm going to come down to seamless textures. So I'll double click on that. And I've got my personal textures and some other textures I downloaded online. When I click on my textures, you can see I've then filed them relatively neatly into different categories that I use again and again. And so let's say I go to wood and timber. I'll change this to being icons. Okay, so I have these icons here. You're going to notice that a lot of these are like the same sort of timber, and I've just changed them. A great example is this wood texture here. So it started off as this material or this color. And basically what I did here is I just in Photoshop changed the color and the tone of that wood. So that is all the same texture, but just different tones. And that's basically all you're going to need. So I don't need to go find every type of wood under the sun. I just need to find a really nice high resolution, seamless, repeatable texture. And then we can change the characteristics and the colorization within Photoshop. So what I've done in this instance, I've already downloaded a texture. So once you've downloaded that texture and filed it in the right location, we can then go File Open in Photoshop, either Control O or File Open, and I'm going to find that herringbone pattern, which is here. I'll double click on that, and that's going to open up the herringbone pattern itself. So it's just a herringbone timber in a relatively modest low tone grey brown ashy color. So I need to select this, and then I need to copy it and paste it into our floor plan. So the first step is within here, I'm going to, in the layers palette, you're going to find that because this is just a default image, it's a padlocked layer. So I'll click on the little padlock here, and that unlocks the layer. That's done. Next up, Control A, that selects the whole image, and then you'll see my mouse turns into a mouse with scissors, and then Control C, so copy. I'm going to go back into my project. I'm going to make sure I'm on the colors layer. I must be on the colors layer. I'm then going to come up to select, and then I'm going to click on color range, and that's going to bring up this little box here. And what that's doing now is as I go around, you see I get the little crosshairs. You may get the little eyedropper, and every time you click, it's going to bring up this little preview of what it's selecting. So this is what's called a mask. So everything that's black is not selected. Everything that is white is selected. And then this fullness here is sort of like the tolerance for what type of pixels it picks up. So if two colors are too close together, this is the risk with this situation. This is why you should pick colors that are so vibrant and contrasty to each other. If you pick two colors that are close together, Photoshop may end up picking up pixels of other colors that are close. So you'll end up with these selections that are quite messy and not what you want. So I'll bring this back up to here. So make sure I'm selecting basically any pixel that is this color. I'll click on that again and then hit OK. You can see now that ends up selecting perfectly around where we painted that and around every object. Again, we still have this selected, and I've gone Control C, so that's now done. This is now selected as well, the color on the colors layer. The final thing to do is to go up to Edit, and then we want to go down to Paste Special and Paste Into. I'll click that, and then I get this texture down here, and I'm just clicking on dragging that now. So you can see we've got a new layer. The layer's got a mask on it, which is only showing us in the white zones where that texture is, which is why it allows me to essentially move this around, and I don't have to cut this texture out ever. This is it's so much easier. I'm going to zoom in, and now what we can do, first of all, let's rename this layer. Let's call this one timber flooring and enter. And then the actual material itself, let's rotate this. The herringbone pattern, would it be this way? It would most likely be, yeah, it would most likely be that way. So to rotate the texture, again, now I'm out of the colors layer, I'm purely on the timber flooring layer. I'm gonna type just on my keyboard, I'm gonna use the shortcut Control T, and that brings up the transform tools. That allows me to, drag this and rotate it and whatnot. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate it. So hover my mouse over one of the corners, hold shift on my keyboard and move my mouse. And when I hold shift, it will rotate it at increments, similar to polar snap in AutoCAD, how it like snaps at 10 degree or 15 degree increments. So I'll do that until it's rotated 90 degrees. I'm then going to hit enter on my keyboard, and that completes the transform. So now I can go around moving it again. I might want to change its size as well. So if I want to change its size, again, I'll go Control T, and I'll use these corner grips here. And if I want to move it in proportion, again, hold down shift and you'll see that it will grow and shrink in proportion. And that's pretty important because you don't want to distort the texture. If I do something like this, I end up making the herringbone a shallower angle, and that's just, graphically, physically that's not correct. Okay, so I'll make that a little bit smaller, like so. And then again, hit enter once I'm done. Now, how do I copy this around? Copy this around the floor plan? Well, the first thing I'll do is I'll put this in the corner somewhere nice and neat and tidy. And then I am still on the timber layer. I'm going to grab my marquee tool, and I'm going to click and drag. Okay, so because I'm on the timber layer, it's only selecting the timber boards within this marquee zone. It's not selecting the CAD drawing or anything like that because that's on another layer. I'm then going to click V, or I'll click move. All right, so now we're on the cut, the move tool. I'm going to hold down Alt on my keyboard, and you'll see my mouse turns into this black and white mouse arrows. What that means is I'm about to copy this selection within this box. I can then just click and drag my mouse, and you can see I'm copying that and dragging and making another version. And then I can let go, and then that's another floorboard complete. I can copy it again by holding down Alt on the keyboard, and I can make another copy and another copy, and so on and so forth. But notice that I'm still on one layer. I haven't actually copied the layer. I've just copied a selection of the layer. So I'm going to go back to the start. So I'll go back to here. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down Alt and Shift on my keyboard. And what that does is that means I can only move it left to right. It's kind of like snaps. So I'll move that to somewhere around here just to eyeball it. That looks good. And I'm going to do that again. I'm going to hold down Alt and Shift and move to the right. And I'm going to keep going until it snaps. So that's now done. I'll go Control D on the keyboard, which then deselects it. And now I can select all three of these textures that were here. Again, still on the timber flooring layer. I'll grab the marquee tool and click and drag. Now I've selected all of that timber texture within that area. I'll go V on my keyboard, or the move command, and do that again. Alt, Shift, click and drag up. That's good. And then again, Alt, Shift, drag up. All right, that's done. Control D to deselect, and now I can actually, I've got this little piece here, so I'm just gonna go M, select the whole damn thing. I wanna make sure I'm selecting it all. V, Alt, Shift, left click, drag my hand to the left. That's now snapped. Control D, we're done. That's now complete. I can turn off the colors layer, and you'll see now I've got a really nice trimmed herringbone pattern in our floor plan. I can also go the other way where I can turn off the CAD lines, and you can see I've got that perfectly trimmed material pattern.